We think memory loss begins with forgetting. It doesn't. It begins with a limp in your step you never noticed, a half-second hesitation before your foot lands, a stride that's grown quieter, more cautious, more afraid. I've spent years listening to people describe the moments right before everything changed, in relationships, in bodies, in minds, and what strikes me is this. The body always speaks first. Long before the mind admits it's losing something, the body is already grieving it. Your walk is not just movement. It's a conversation your brain is having with itself about balance, about confidence, about how safe it still feels in the world. And new research shows that conversation can reveal dementia's presence a full decade before memory ever falters. So the question isn't, when will I start forgetting? It's, what is my body already trying to tell me that I haven't been willing to hear? Today we're going to listen, because the earliest warning sign of dementia isn't in your mind, it's in your walk. And I want to start with a confession, not mine, but one I've watched 1,000 times without realizing what I was seeing. Somewhere in this room tonight, someone is thinking about a parent, about the way they've started walking a little differently, slower, more careful, a hand that reaches for the counter that never used to need reaching for. And every single time we tell ourselves the same comforting lie, they're just getting older. I'm here to tell you that lie is costing us the most valuable thing medicine has ever offered us in this disease: time. For decades, we've been taught to watch the mind for the first sign of trouble, a forgotten name, a missed appointment, a blank pause where recognition used to live instantly. We wait for the mind to fail, and only then do we act. But what if I told you the body had already been trying to warn us for years in a language we simply never learned to read? Not through blood work, not through a scan, through something far simpler, far more ordinary, something every single person in this room does without a second thought 1,000 times a day: the walk. New research is revealing something extraordinary. The way a person walks can reveal the earliest signs of cognitive decline as much as a full decade before memory ever falters. Not a metaphor, not intuition, measurable, physical, undeniable evidence hiding in plain sight in something as unremarkable as a stride across a kitchen floor. Tonight, I'm not going to talk to you about forgetting. I'm going to talk to you about walking, and why, for the first time, we have the chance to hear what the body has been saying all along, a full 10 years before the mind admits it's listening to. But I want you to think about the last time you watched someone you love walk across a room. Maybe it was your mother, maybe your father coming in from the garden, or your grandfather getting up from his chair to answer the door, and maybe, just maybe, you noticed something, a little hesitation, a shuffle where there used to be a stride, a hand reaching for the wall that never used to need reaching for. And you probably told yourself what we all tell ourselves: they're just getting older. That's what happens. Nothing to see here. I want to challenge that assumption tonight, because I think it's costing us more than we realize. Here's what 30 years of studying metabolic and neurological disease has taught me. The body does not wait for permission to tell the truth. It doesn't wait for a diagnosis. It doesn't wait for a blood test or an MRI or a specialist with a clipboard. Long before the mind is willing or able to admit that something is wrong, the body has already begun its confession, quietly, physically, one step at a time. We've been trained, all of us, to think of dementia as a disease of forgetting, a stolen name, a missed anniversary, a blank stare where recognition used to live. And because that's the story we've been told, that's the only warning sign we're watching for. We wait for the mind to fail before we act. But by the time memory goes, the disease has often been quietly rewriting the brain for years, sometimes decades, before a single name was ever forgotten. So where was it hiding all that time? In the walk. Think about what walking actually requires of your brain. It's not simple. It's not automatic in the way we assume. Every step demands balance, timing, spatial awareness, coordination between what your eyes see and what your legs do, split-second decisions about uneven ground, about pace, about where your body is in space. That's an extraordinary amount of neurological real estate being used every single time you cross a kitchen floor. And it turns out the very same networks responsible for that seamless coordination are deeply entangled with the networks responsible for memory, for processing, for cognition itself. So when those networks begin to fray, even subtly, even before any of us would call it a problem, the legs know before the mind does. A stride gets a little shorter, the rhythm gets a little less certain, the pace slows almost imperceptibly months or years before anyone would think to test your memory at all. This is not a metaphor, this is measurable. This is happening in bodies right now in this room in ways none of us have been trained to notice, because we were taught to watch the mind when we should have been watching the walk. And I say this not to frighten you, I say it because it changes everything about when we get to act. If the earliest warning isn't a memory lapse but a change in gait, then we are no longer powerless bystanders waiting for a diagnosis to arrive. We have a decade where the body is quietly raising its hand, asking to be noticed. The only question is whether we're paying attention. So tonight, I don't want you thinking about memory. I want you thinking about the walk, the one you watched your mother take across that room, the one you take yourself right now without a second thought? Because somewhere in that ordinary, unremarkable motion, the thing we do 1,000 times a day without ever once considering it, is a message. And for the first time in medical history, we are finally learning how to read it. The body has been trying to tell us the truth for years. Tonight we start listening. And now let's talk about what the science actually shows, because I don't want to leave you with a feeling. I want to leave you with evidence. So over the past several years, researchers have been doing something remarkably simple and remarkably overlooked. They've been watching how people walk and then following those same people forward in time, sometimes for a decade or more, to see what happens to their brains, not asking them to solve puzzles, not scanning them first, just watching the walk, the speed, the rhythm, the length of each stride, how much it varies from one step to the next, and then waiting to see who, years later, develops cognitive decline. And what they found should stop us in our tracks. People whose walking speed quietly slowed down, whose stride became shorter or more irregular, whose gait lost that steady, confident rhythm. These were the same people years later, far more likely to be diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment and eventually dementia. Not because slow walking causes dementia, but because the same underlying deterioration in the small blood vessels of the brain, in the white matter that carries signals between regions, in the delicate circuitry connecting movement and thought, was showing up in the legs before it ever showed up on a memory test. Brain imaging backs this up in ways that are hard to argue with. When researchers scan the brains of people with subtle gait changes, they find measurable differences in the areas responsible for executive function, for processing speed, for spatial reasoning, well before those people would ever fail a standard memory screening. The walk isn't a coincidence running alongside the disease. The walk is an early expression of the disease itself. And here's the detail that changed how I think about this entirely. Some of these changes are showing up as much as 10 years before a clinical diagnosis. 10 years, not 10 months. Not 10 weeks of decline before someone finally can't remember their grandchild's name. A full decade of warning encoded in something as unremarkable, as invisible in plain sight as the way someone crosses a room. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Everybody walks a little differently as they age. Isn't this just normal aging? And that's a fair question, but the researchers accounted for that. This isn't about the ordinary gradual slowing we'd expect from an aging joint or a tired muscle. This is about a specific pattern, a loss of rhythm, a growing unpredictability from step to step, a kind of hesitation that has nothing to do with sore knees and everything to do with what's happening upstairs in the brain's control center for movement and cognition alike. What excites me about this research isn't just that it's clever, it's that it's accessible. You don't need a lab, you don't need a 6-month waiting list for a neurologist. Gait, the way we walk, can be observed, measured, and tracked by anyone willing to pay attention in a hallway, in a parking lot, on a simple walk to the mailbox. That accessibility is what makes this discovery so powerful. We've spent decades searching for early warning signs of dementia in expensive scans and invasive tests, and it turns out one of the most honest signals has been walking past us, quite literally, the entire time. So when I tell you that a walk can predict dementia 10 years before memory fails, I'm not offering you a metaphor born of intuition. I'm handing you a body of research, built step by step, quite literally, showing that the earliest chapter of this disease isn't written in what we forget, it's written in how we move. So let's go a little deeper, because I think it's worth understanding why this is even possible. Why would something as basic as walking have anything to do with something as complex as memory? On the surface, they seem like completely different systems. One is physical, mechanical, almost thoughtless. The other feels like the very seat of who we are, our stories, our loved ones' faces, our sense of self across time. It seems almost absurd that the two would be connected at all, but the brain doesn't organize itself the way we organize our assumptions. Walking, as it turns out, is one of the most cognitively demanding things the human body does. We just don't experience it that way because we mastered it so early in life. Think about everything that has to happen in the span of a single step. Your eyes are scanning the ground ahead, reading the terrain. Your inner ear is feeding your brain constant information about balance and orientation. Your spine and legs are coordinating in a precise split-second rhythm. And somewhere above all of that, your brain is making continuous real-time judgments. How fast to go, when to adjust, how to respond if the ground isn't where you expect it to be. That is an enormous amount of processing, and the regions responsible for it are not walled off from the regions responsible for thought. In fact, they overlap. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain we associate with planning, judgment, decision-making, is heavily involved in something called executive control of gait. That's the brain's ability to adjust your walking pattern on the fly, stepping around an obstacle, changing pace on a crowded sidewalk, navigating a curb you didn't see coming. And that same prefrontal machinery is exactly what governs working memory, focus, and the kind of cognitive flexibility that starts to erode in the earliest stages of dementia. Then there's white matter, the brain's wiring, the highways that carry signals between regions. Damage to that wiring, often from years of small vascular changes we never feel happening, doesn't announce itself politely. It shows up wherever the wiring is most taxed, and walking, believe it or not, taxes it constantly, demanding rapid communication between the parts of the brain that plan movement and the parts that execute it. When that communication starts to lag, even by milliseconds, it doesn't just affect coordination. It affects the very same circuitry your brain uses to hold a thought, retrieve a memory, or follow a conversation. So the legs and the mind aren't just distantly related. They are, in a very real physiological sense, drawing from the same well. They share circuitry. They share vulnerability. And when disease begins to erode that well quietly, gradually, invisibly, it doesn't ask permission about which system to affect first. It simply reveals itself wherever the demand is highest and the reserve is thinnest. And for many people, that turns out to be the legs long before it's the mind. This is why I want you to stop thinking of your body as separate departments, a walking department, a memory department, a balance department, each minding its own business. Your brain doesn't work that way. It's a single interconnected system, and everything it does is a conversation between regions that were never meant to work alone, which means the walk was never just about the legs. It never was. It was the mind speaking through the body the whole time. Now, here's where I want to get honest with you, because this is the part that troubles me most. We have this information, the signs are there, and yet almost universally we walk right past them, pun very much intended, because we've been handed a story about aging that tells us not to look too closely. Someone slows down on the stairs and we say, well, their knees aren't what they used to be. Someone starts holding the railing a little tighter, taking a little longer to cross the parking lot, and we say, that's just getting older. Someone hesitates before stepping off a curb or takes shorter, more careful steps than they used to, and we call it caution, we call it wisdom, we call it nothing at all, because it happens so gradually that nobody ever announces it. And there's no single dramatic moment, no fall, no fainting, just a slow, quiet recalibration that we absorb into the background of daily life without ever asking why it's happening. And I understand why, because the alternative, actually stopping to ask what a change in gait might mean, feels frightening. It feels like inviting a diagnosis we're not ready to hear. So instead, we build 1,000 small, comfortable explanations. Bad knees, tired feet, a long day, getting older, that's all. Each one plausible on its own, each one just convincing enough to let us look away. But here's what should give us pause. A loss of rhythm when walking, a stride that becomes unpredictable from step to step rather than smoothly, evenly slower, is different from ordinary fatigue or joint pain. Ordinary aging tends to be consistent. A bad knee behaves the same way today as it did last month. What we're talking about here is something subtler and frankly more unsettling, a kind of hesitation and uncertainty in the body's timing, a growing gap between intention and execution. The brain says go, and the legs respond just a little late, just a little unevenly. That's not a joint problem. That's a communication problem happening in real time between mind and body. And because it doesn't look dramatic, because it doesn't interrupt anyone's day, it almost never gets mentioned to a doctor. Think about the last time you sat in an exam room. The questions were about blood pressure, cholesterol, maybe your memory, maybe your mood. Nobody asked you how you crossed the parking lot to get there. Nobody timed your walk down the hallway. We have built an entire system of preventive medicine that, for the most part, simply isn't looking at one of the earliest, most measurable warning signs available to us. So the signs are being missed, not because they're invisible, but because we've collectively agreed not to see them. We've normalized the exact behavior that deserves our attention. And every year that passes without that attention is a year where intervention, the kind that can genuinely change the trajectory of this disease, becomes a little less possible. I don't say this to make anyone feel guilty for not noticing their own mother's slower steps or their own hesitation on the stairs. I say it because awareness is the entire point of standing here tonight. The moment we stop dismissing these signs as just getting older is the moment we reclaim a decade we didn't know we had. The walk was never asking to be ignored. It was asking to be understood. So let's move from awareness to action, because I don't want anyone leaving this room simply feeling alarmed. I want you leaving with something you can actually do tonight, tomorrow morning, the next time you see someone you love walk across a room. Here's the good news. You don't need a hospital. You don't need an appointment 6 months from now with a specialist whose waiting list is longer than the disease's warning period itself. What you need is about 60 seconds, a hallway or a driveway, and a willingness to actually pay attention to something you've spent your whole life ignoring. Start with pace. It's not a race, not a performance. It's just an ordinary walk, the way someone would naturally move from one room to another. Researchers use a simple benchmark covering roughly a normal walking distance in a normal amount of time. When that pace drops noticeably from what it used to be, not because of a sore hip or a bad shoe, but as a general creeping slowness, that's worth noting. Write it down, not to panic over, just to notice. Next, watch the rhythm, not just the speed. This is the part most people miss entirely, because we're trained to ask, are they slower, when the more revealing question is, are they steadier? A healthy gait has a kind of quiet consistency. Each each step roughly like the last, evenly spaced, evenly timed. What you're watching for is variability. Does one step land a little short and the next a little long? Does the rhythm seem to hesitate, almost like someone thinking too hard about something that should be automatic? That unevenness, more than slowness alone, is one of the most telling signals researchers have identified. 30, and this one is simple enough to try on yourself right now, standing exactly where you are. Try walking while counting backward from 100 by sevens. Ordinary walking asks very little of your conscious attention, but when you add a mental task on top of it, you're asking the brain to divide its resources between movement and thought at the same time. In a healthy brain, walking barely falters. It's automatic enough to withstand the distraction. But when the circuitry connecting movement and cognition has started to fray, that divided attention often reveals itself immediately. The pace drops, the steps become uneven. People stop walking altogether just to finish the sentence in their head because the brain can no longer confidently do both at once. That single 60-second test, walking while thinking, is one of the most quietly powerful screening tools we have, and it costs nothing. I want to be clear about something important. None of this replaces a doctor. None of this is a diagnosis. A slower walk, an uneven step, a moment of hesitation while counting backward. These are signals, not verdicts. What they deserve is not fear, but follow-up, a conversation with a physician, a baseline measurement so that 6 months or a year from now you have something to compare against, rather than relying on memory and guesswork about whether things have changed. That's really the heart of what I want to leave you with tonight. Not a warning, but a practice, a habit of noticing. The next time you watch your father cross the kitchen or your mother walk to the mailbox or you catch your own reflection in a store window mid-stride, look, actually look. Is the rhythm steady? Is the pace what it used to be? Could you hold a conversation, do simple math, and keep walking without missing a beat? Because for the first time, we're not waiting helplessly for memory to fail before we act. We have a window, a real, measurable, decade-long window, and the only tool required to open it is attention. The test was never complicated. The only thing standing in the way was whether we were willing to look. So now the question becomes, what do we actually do with a decade? Because knowing something 10 years in advance is only meaningful if that knowledge changes what happens next. Otherwise, it's just a longer runway toward the same outcome. And I refuse to stand here and hand you a decade's worth of warning without also handing you a decade's worth of possibility. Here is what the research is increasingly telling us, and it's some of the most hopeful data in this entire field. The same systems responsible for that early warning, the circuitry linking movement and cognition, are remarkably responsive to intervention. Not cured, not reversed like flipping a switch, but responsive, malleable, capable of being strengthened even in a brain that has already begun to change. Start with the most obvious, most underestimated tool we have, movement itself. Not walking as transportation, but walking as therapy, walking as medicine. Structured exercise, especially the kind that challenges balance and coordination alongside cardiovascular effort, has been shown to improve blood flow to the brain, support the growth of new connections between neurons, and strengthen the very white matter pathways we talked about earlier, the ones carrying signals between the regions that plan a step and the regions that hold a thought. This isn't about training for a marathon, it's about consistency, 20-30 minutes most days, ideally something that asks your body to balance, to turn, to adjust, because that's what recruits the brain, not just the legs. And then there's what I'd call dual tasking on purpose, deliberately practicing the very thing we used as a screening tool, walking while doing simple mental work, walking while having a real conversation, one that requires actual thought and response, not passive listening, dance which combines rhythm, memory, spatial awareness, and social connection all at once is one of the most cognitively rich activities a person can do, and it happens to look exactly like fun, which is precisely why people stick with it. We can't ignore the metabolic piece either, because the blood vessels feeding the brain are the same blood vessels affected by blood pressure, blood sugar, and inflammation throughout the body. Managing those through diet, through movement, through simply not letting chronic low-grade metabolic stress run unchecked for decades isn't just about the heart. It's about protecting the exact vascular network that, when damaged, shows up first as an unsteady step and years later as a fading memory. And then, just as important as anything physical, connection. Isolation itself is one of the strongest predictors of cognitive decline we know of. A body walking alone day after day in silence does not get the same protective benefit as a body walking beside someone else in conversation and relationship. So part of this prescription is almost embarrassingly simple. Walk with someone. Talk while you do it. Let the mind and the legs work together in the company of another person the way they were always meant to. None of this is about chasing perfection or turning every walk into a clinical exercise. It's about shifting how we spend the decade we've just discovered we have. And instead of a silent countdown toward decline, it becomes an active window for movement, for connection, for attention, for the kind of small repeated choices that quietly reshape the trajectory trajectory of a life. I started tonight by asking you to remember the last time you watched someone you love cross a room. I want to end by asking you to imagine the next time. Imagine noticing, really noticing the rhythm of that walk. Imagine using what we now know, not to live in fear, but to act while there's still time to act, because the disease was never going to announce itself loudly. It was always going to whisper through a slower step, an uneven stride, a hesitation nobody thought to question. The walk was always talking. The only thing left to decide is whether we're finally ready to listen. I want to start with a confession, not mine, but one I've watched 1,000 times without realizing what I was seeing. Somewhere in this room tonight, someone is thinking about a parent, about the way they've started walking a little differently, slower, more careful, a hand that reaches for the counter that never used to need reaching for. And every single time we tell ourselves the same comforting lie, they're just getting older. I'm here to tell you that lie is costing us the most valuable thing medicine has ever offered us in this disease: time. For decades, we've been taught to watch the mind for the first sign of trouble, a forgotten name, a missed appointment, a blank pause where recognition used to live instantly. We wait for the mind to fail, and only then do we act. But what if I told you the body had already been trying to warn us for years in a language we simply never learned to read? Not through blood work, not through a scan, through something far simpler, far more ordinary, something every single person in this room does without a second thought 1,000 times a day: the walk. New research is revealing something extraordinary. The way a person walks can reveal the earliest signs of cognitive decline as much as a full decade before memory ever falters. Not a metaphor, not intuition, measurable, physical, undeniable evidence hiding in plain sight in something as unremarkable as a stride across a kitchen floor. Tonight, I'm not going to talk to you about forgetting. I'm going to talk to you about walking, and why, for the first time, we have the chance to hear what the body has been saying all along, a full 10 years before the mind admits it's listening to.